Princess Elissa, gentle, innocent, and sacrificed to save her father's dying realm. On the night of her wedding, she received a gift, a crimson veil, glowing like spilled blood. They said it was a blessing. They said it would protect her from death. But they were wrong. From that night onward, love became a curse, and the bride's name was bound to a darkness that has never faded, even after centuries. The kingdom of Armonia was a place where time itself seemed to decay. Long before anyone could remember, it had been a land of divine faith and endless prayer, where golden bells rang across misty hills and pilgrims walked barefoot to the towering stone cathedrals. But now, centuries later, silence ruled the kingdom. The churches had crumbled. The bells were rusted and mute. The air hung heavy with the scent of ash and forgotten hymns. At the heart of this dying world stood the royal palace, an ancient fortress of blackened marble and broken angels carved into its walls. The once sacred corridors were dimly lit by torches that flickered as if afraid to burn. The wind that whispered through the halls carried with it something strange, almost like voices. Some said it was the echo of old prayers. Others said it was the restless souls of those who had died in the king's wars. But despite the decay, the kingdom prepared for celebration. The wedding of Princess Elissa, the last heir of Armonia's royal bloodline. Her marriage was meant to bring peace to a land drowning in fear. The banners were raised, the chapel was decorated with dying roses, and the villagers prayed this union might lift the ancient curse that had haunted their soil for generations. Yet beneath all the joy and ceremony, the people felt a quiet dread. The sky above Armonia had turned pale and sickly, the moon refusing to show itself. Ravens circled the chapel roof as if guarding something unseen. And deep beneath the palace, where the stones were cold and wet, something moved, something that had waited for this night for a very long time. The kingdom of Armonia would witness a wedding, but it would also witness its own damnation. Princess Elissa was the last breath of grace left in the dying kingdom. She was young, perhaps 20, with hair like dark silk and eyes that held the sadness of 1,000 winters. From the moment she was born, her life had belonged not to herself, but to Armonia. Her father, King Aldrin, had promised her hand to Lord Marius of the North, a man she had never met, but one whose armies could save the crumbling empire. As the wedding day approached, the palace shimmered with forced joy. Servants rushed through candlelit corridors, decorating the ancient chapel with roses that wilted before sunset. Musicians tuned their lutes in trembling hands. But Elissa did not smile. Her reflection in the mirror grew paler with each passing day, as if something was slowly drawing the color out of her soul. She often wandered alone through the cold corridors, her footsteps echoing like ghostly whispers. The portraits of past queens watched her as she passed, their painted eyes hollow, their smiles faded. Rumors said every queen of Armonia had died before her 30th year, and some whispered that the royal bloodline itself was cursed. The night before her wedding, Elissa stood at her window and watched the moonless sky. The air was heavy, still, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. She whispered a prayer, not for love, not for power, but for escape. Little did she know, something in the shadows was listening. And before the night was over, a visitor would come to her chamber, bringing with her a gift wrapped in crimson silk. A gift that would bind Elissa's name to the darkest chapter in Armonia's history, the crimson veil. It was deep into the night when the castle bells tolled, not for worship, but for warning. Yet no one heard them except Elissa. The sound came from somewhere distant, muffled, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. She turned toward the door as a faint knock echoed through her chamber. When she opened it, an old woman stood there, cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath layers of shadow. Her voice was soft, trembling, and yet it carried an ancient weight. "My lady," she whispered, "I bring you a blessing for your wedding." In her wrinkled hands lay a folded piece of deep red fabric. The moment Elissa touched it, she felt a cold surge crawl up her arm, as though the cloth were alive. "It is a veil," the woman said, "a veil woven with devotion, meant to protect you from death itself." But when Elissa looked closer, she saw that the threads glistened like dried blood under the candlelight. The woman smiled faintly, her teeth dark and broken. "Wear it," she murmured, "and no blade, no curse, no grave shall take you." Before Elissa could speak, The woman vanished, as though swallowed by the darkness of the corridor. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered out one by one. Alone, trembling, Elissa unfolded the veil. A whisper seemed to rise from the fabric, soft at first, then louder, clearer. It was a voice. It said her name, and as she lifted the crimson veil to her face, her reflection in the mirror began to change. Her lips turned pale, her eyes clouded, and across the glass, in strokes of blood red, words appeared. With every full moon, you shall return. The morning sun never touched Armoni that day. A cold, red haze covered the kingdom, and even the doves that once circled the chapel roof were nowhere to be seen. Elissa awoke from a restless sleep, her heart pounding, her pillow damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. The crimson veil lay folded beside her, but it looked different now, darker, heavier, as if it had absorbed something through the night. When she reached to touch it, her fingers came away stained faintly red. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt locked. Summoned by the king, she walked through the long corridor toward the wedding chapel. The air seemed thicker with every step, and whispers followed her, voices that weren't there a moment ago. "Return to us," they said. "The veil remembers." Inside the chapel, candles burned low, casting trembling shadows on the ancient walls. Elissa paused before the altar and caught sight of herself in the gilded mirror above the baptismal font. Her reflection didn't move when she did. Instead, it lifted the crimson veil and placed it gently over her head. As the fabric touched her skin, something seared into her blood, a pulse, not her own, thundering through her veins. She gasped and fell to her knees. On the mirror's surface, glowing words appeared as if written in blood. "With every full moon, you shall return." The priests rushed toward her, but none could see the writing. Only Elissa could. Only she could feel the invisible chain wrap around her soul, a blood oath older than her kingdom, binding her life to something that had long been dead. And from that moment on, the veil no longer belonged to her. She belonged to it. The wedding day arrived with a silence that felt unnatural. Not a single bird sang. The wind didn't stir. Even the torches that lined the palace halls burned lower than usual, their flames struggling as if suffocating. The great chapel of Armonia was filled with nobles, priests, and guards, all dressed in mourning black instead of festive white. The kingdom had not seen a royal wedding in decades, yet the people smiled nervously, pretending to believe that this one would bring peace. Elissa stood before the altar, her hands trembling beneath the crimson veil. Beneath it, her breathing echoed like a trapped whisper. When the priest began the vows, she felt her pulse quicken, and the fabric of the veil grew warm, then hot, then burning. A sudden gust of wind burst through the chapel doors. Every candle blew out at once, plunging the room into darkness. The guests gasped, someone screamed. In that moment, the organ began to play, though no one sat at its keys. The priest continued, voice shaking. "Do you, Princess Elissa, take this man?" But the words were drowned by another sound, a low, echoing whisper that filled the chapel. "She is already taken." The crowd fell silent. A shadow moved across the altar, tall and formless, touching the edges of the veil. The bride's body trembled violently, and blood began to seep from beneath the fabric, drop by drop, staining the white marble beneath her feet. The candles reignited by themselves, revealing Elissa standing motionless, her head bowed, her dress now streaked with crimson. No one saw her eyes beneath the veil. No one dared to lift it. By dawn, the palace gates were opened to screams. Elissa's body had been found at the foot of the chapel stairs, lying in the cold dew. Her skin was pale, her lips the color of ashes. No wound marked her flesh, yet her heart had simply stopped. The crimson veil was still wrapped tightly around her face. When the servants tried to remove it, the fabric clung to her skin as though fused. One maid swore she saw the cloth pulse, like it was breathing. The king demanded that the veil be destroyed. But when the guards tried to burn it, the fire went cold. When they buried it with her, the soil refused to settle. The priest said prayers, but his voice faltered when a single drop of blood rolled from beneath the veil and hit the stone. That night, thunder cracked across the sky. The chapel doors slammed open, and the bells began to ring on their own. In the storm's howling wind, a faint figure was seen standing by the gates, the shape of a bride, her veil glowing faintly red in the rain. The guards who approached her never returned. By morning, only their helmets were found, filled with water that smelled of iron and decay. The kingdom mourned, but whispers spread like fire, that the veil was cursed, that it had chosen its bride, and that death was not the end of her story. Because even in death, they said, Princess Elissa's heart was still beating, not for love, but for vengeance. The morning after the funeral, the castle was silent. No bells rang. No prayers were spoken. Even the wind refused to move through the black drapes that hung from the windows. Elissa's coffin had been sealed inside the royal crypt, yet something about her burial felt unfinished. The queen, trembling and pale, demanded that the crimson veil be removed before the coffin was closed. She cannot meet God with her face covered, she whispered. But when the servants tried to lift it, the fabric would not move. It had fused to Elissa's skin, as though her flesh had melted into the cloth. One servant tugged harder. The moment his fingers brushed the veil, he screamed and fell back, his hand blistered with burn marks that glowed faintly red. The priest shouted, "Leave it. The veil has claimed her." After that day, no one dared to open the coffin again. But the whispers began. At night, servants heard soft rustling beneath the chapel floor, like silk brushing against stone. Some swore they saw a faint red light seeping through the cracks in the crypt door. On the third night, the maid who had dressed the princess vanished. Her room was found in disarray, her mirror shattered, and written across the broken glass were 3 words, drawn in blood. "Do not lift it." The king ordered the crypt to be sealed with iron. But those who lived in the castle swore that when the moonlight touched the chapel windows, they could still see a faint shape behind the stone, a bride, standing, waiting. And her veil was moving. 7 nights after the burial, the moon rose, swollen, bright, and unnaturally red. The entire kingdom of Armoni slept uneasily, haunted by dreams of a bride walking through endless corridors, her veil trailing behind her like a river of blood. At midnight, the church bell began to toll. No one pulled its ropes. Each strike echoed across the valley, deep and mournful, until every flame in the palace flickered and died. In her chamber, the queen awoke to the smell of roses, but not living roses. These were the kind that grow only on graves. She turned and froze. Standing by her window was a figure in a crimson veil. The fabric shimmered in the moonlight, glistening wet, as if freshly soaked. The queen called out her daughter's name, but the figure did not move. Slowly, it turned its head, and beneath the veil 2 faint, glowing eyes appeared, empty, pale, and endless. Across the kingdom, mirrors began to fog from within. In each reflection, Elissa appeared, standing behind those who dared to look. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her head slightly bowed, as though still waiting for her vows to be completed. By dawn, 5 people were missing, the guards stationed outside the chapel. The only thing found near their posts were trails of red silk drifting through the grass. The full moon set behind the hills, but the bell never stopped ringing. And deep in the crypt, Elissa's coffin stood open. The veil was gone. The curse revealed itself slowly, not as a storm, but as a sickness. Those who had attended Elissa's wedding began to change. At first, they complained of hearing whispers in their sleep, a woman's voice, gentle and familiar, saying, "Follow me." Then came the bleeding. Tiny cuts appeared across their wrists and throats, as if from invisible hands. Each morning, their sheets were stained with red, the same shade as the veil. One by one, the palace maids vanished. The guards refused to enter the lower halls. Mirrors were covered, and no one dared to ring the chapel bell again. Yet even with every precaution, the voice continued, whispering through the walls, growing stronger each night. On the 10th day, the king entered his throne room to find a message written in blood on the marble floor. "She calls you." That evening, the palace gates opened on their own. A red mist rolled across the courtyard, bringing with it the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, like a bride walking down an endless aisle. The priests declared it divine punishment. The soldiers said it was witchcraft. But those who looked into the fog swore they saw her, Princess Elissa, walking among them, veil flowing behind her, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for someone to answer her call. The crimson veil had awakened, and it was searching for its next soul. The night of the second full moon arrived, crimson and heavy, hanging over the ruins of the chapel like a bleeding eye. A cold wind swept through the valley, carrying the faint sound of distant laughter. But it wasn't joyful. It was hollow, echoing, and wrong. At midnight, the villagers saw torches flickering in the castle gardens. The guards, terrified yet duty-bound, went to investigate. What they saw that night was never spoken of again, at least not by those who survived. A slow procession of women moved across the courtyard, all wearing tattered wedding gowns, their faces hidden beneath veils the color of dried blood. Some floated inches above the ground, others dragged their feet, leaving streaks of red in the grass. The air around them shimmered as if the world itself recoiled from their presence. At the front of the procession walked Elissa, her veil brighter than the rest, glowing faintly like a lantern in the dark. Her dress was soaked in rain and blood, her bouquet of dead roses dripping crimson petals. As they passed, the torches dimmed, and the ground beneath them trembled. From the chapel came the faint sound of an organ playing, the same wedding hymn that had played on Elissa's cursed day. When the last bride turned her head, the guards saw only empty eye sockets beneath the veil. Moments later, every torch went out. The next morning, the garden was empty, but the grass was stained deep red, and along the castle walls, hundreds of handprints marked the stone, pressed there in blood. The dead brides had returned to dance, and they would not leave alone. Desperate to end the terror, the king summoned Father Barin, a priest known for exorcising haunted relics. He arrived with holy water, relics, and ancient scrolls. The castle servants watched as he drew circles of salt and lit candles at every window. "This curse is bound by a promise," he said, "and a promise written in blood must be broken with fire." At dusk, he entered the chapel where Elissa had taken her vows. The altar was cold, covered in dried roses and wax. He began his prayer, voice steady but trembling beneath the silence. The moment he invoked the sacred name, a gust of wind burst through the chapel, extinguishing every flame. The priest continued, shouting the words, but the echoes changed, twisting, mocking him in a voice that wasn't his own. The organ began to play again, this time backwards. He threw holy water toward the altar. The droplets hissed, as if burning on unseen flesh. Then the veil appeared, floating in the air, slowly turning toward him like a face without form. Father Barin raised his cross. "By God's light, I cast thee out," he cried. But a voice answered, soft and almost loving. "There is no God here." The priest fell to his knees. Blood poured from his eyes, his lips whispering the same vow that had cursed Elissa. "With every full moon, she shall return." When the guards found him, he was blind and shaking, his hands clutching the blood-soaked cross. He managed only one final sentence before his heart stopped. "The veil is her soul." After the priest's death, fear consumed the castle. No one slept. No one dared speak Elissa's name aloud. Yet one brave knight, Sir Rorik, refused to surrender to the superstition. Determined to uncover the truth, he searched the castle's archives, following every legend tied to the veil. The records led him deep beneath the palace, into catacombs older than the kingdom itself. The air was cold, thick with dust, and the faint scent of iron. He followed a narrow passageway that ended at a sealed iron door, marked with strange symbols. With trembling hands, he forced it open. Inside, his torch revealed hundreds of crimson veils hanging from hooks that lined the stone walls. Each one shimmered faintly, as though breathing. Beneath them were skeletal remains, brides, long forgotten, still wearing fragments of their wedding gowns. Every veil bore the same sigil stitched in black thread, a single tear falling into a circle of fire. As Rorik stepped closer, the air shifted. The veils began to sway, whispering in unison, a sound like rustling silk mixed with sighs. He froze as one veil detached from its hook and floated toward him, curling around his wrist like a living thing. He dropped the torch. Darkness swallowed the chamber, and the whispering turned into soft, mocking laughter. When the other knights found him hours later, Rorik was still alive, but his hair had turned white, and his eyes stared blankly ahead. He spoke only 4 words before collapsing dead. They were all brides. King Aldrin had once ruled with iron certainty, but after the priest's death and the knight's disappearance, his mind began to unravel. The castle's corridors whispered at night. Paintings wept blood. Every mirror reflected the image of Elissa, standing just behind him, her crimson veil shimmering like a living flame. He stopped sleeping. Servants often found him wandering the halls barefoot, muttering to himself, holding her wedding ring in trembling fingers. "She was my child," he'd whisper, "my only light, and I gave her to death." Desperate, he ordered every relic, every veil, every trace of her memory burned. But when the fires rose in the courtyard, the flames turned black. The veils did not burn, they screamed. Their shrill wails echoed through the valley, shaking the stained glass and cracking the chapel walls. That night, the king locked himself in the throne room. The guards heard him shouting, begging forgiveness from someone unseen. When they finally forced the doors open, Aldrin was sitting on the throne, his eyes wide and empty, his crown fallen beside him. A crimson veil was wrapped tightly around his head, soaked in fresh blood. Scrawled on the floor in his own hand were the words, "The veil belongs to her." From that night onward, no one dared to touch the throne again. The kingdom began to rot from within, as if the curse had spread beyond bloodlines, infecting the land itself. The third full moon rose, enormous and red, bathing the ruined castle in a sickly glow. Thunder rolled across the sky, though no lightning followed. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of iron. As the bells tolled midnight, the first drops began to fall, not rain, but blood. Thick, dark, and endless. It splattered the stones, the windows, and the graves beyond the chapel. The villagers fled, covering their heads in terror, but the blood followed them, seeping through roofs, staining the earth. Crops withered. The river turned red. In the castle courtyard, the ground split open, revealing the ancient catacombs below. From within, a soft light glowed, the color of dying embers. And through the crimson storm, the dead brides rose once more. Elissa led them. Her veil burned faintly, and her face, once gentle, now carried a sorrow so deep it made the air itself weep. She walked barefoot across the flooded stones, whispering to the storm, "Until every promise breaks." The castle trembled. Towers cracked and fell. The chapel bell rang one last time, on its own, before collapsing into the red flood. When dawn finally came, the rain stopped, but the land was silent. The river had dried, leaving only crimson mud, and every trace of the royal bloodline had vanished. Only the veil remained, floating in the ruins, untouched by wind or fire. Centuries passed. The kingdom of Armonia became a forgotten ruin swallowed by the forest. The villagers built their homes far away, whispering warnings to their children never to wander near the crimson hills. But every full moon, they said, a faint bell still rings beneath the soil, and a single bride walks among the ruins, her veil glowing softly in the dark. Scholars who dared to explore the site spoke of strange lights and echoes of weeping that came from underground. One claimed to have found the veil itself, preserved in perfect condition despite the decay around it. When he tried to take it, his skin blistered, and the voices began, whispers calling his name, asking him to finish the vow. Those who saw him after that said his eyes had turned red, and at night, he could be heard crying out a single phrase over and over again. "With every full moon, she shall return." Legends now say that the crimson veil is eternal. It seeks new brides, new souls to wear it, binding them to Elissa's curse. And so, when the blood moon rises and the wind carries the scent of roses and rain, some say you can still hear her footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the ruins of her kingdom. A wedding song plays faintly in the distance. The air grows cold, and if you listen closely, you can hear the whisper behind you. Do you take this vow? Subscribe to my channel, because the next story is even darker. Waxing crescent moon.